Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the conference, but especially with this last panel when all of you in this audience have stayed here all day. And I would pay a tribute and call you the Gush Emunim, but I know it would give offense to some of the Israelis here. I have no slides to present. My main technological problem actually is going to be to read my handwriting. I want to talk about what has changed and what has not changed and what lessons perhaps we can draw for Israeli conduct from the overall situation that Israel faces. I think in general that there's a tendency to think that more has changed than really has in Israel's strategic situation. For example, relations with Arab states, there are no new peace treaties, nor are there any in sight, nor have the two that exist really come under any threat. It was mentioned yesterday that even in the period in which President Morsi was leading Egypt, there was no threat to the peace treaty. The main enemies that Israel faces in terms of those who are shooting, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas. The Arab states with which Israel deals have not really changed in the manner of governance, even given the so-called Arab Spring. Arab hostility at the popular level seems not to have changed. The willingness of Arab regimes to resist that hostility, to deal with Israel even in the face of that hostility, has not changed. It was noticeable, for example, in the case of Tunisia, there was a proposal to include in the new constitution a ban on any kind of dealing with the Zionist entity. And it was the leader of the Islamist party, Rashid Ghannouchi, who said, that doesn't belong in a constitution. And it won't go into our constitution, even in the period in which Ennahda, his party, was riding high. And in Europe, that sort of mix of hostility and cooperation with Israel at the popular and government level, I think, has also not changed very much. But some things have changed. On the plus side, Hezbollah and Hamas, and this is a plus in a way, now govern territory, and therefore they can be deterred. They were deterred in the case of Hezbollah by the 2006 war. Hamas has been deterred. Admittedly, it requires repeated actions over the years, but you now see what is generally estimated as hundreds of Hamas soldiers guarding the Israel-Gaza border to prevent attacks. That's a change. On the positive side, on the negative side, certainly one has to say the arrival here of a really serious al-Qaeda jihadi presence very near here in Syria, because they are not deterrable. They do not govern territory. And that's a very significant change over the last several years. Another change, certainly over the last few years, is the reduction in U.S. influence. It's very clear. General Yadlin's question to General Petraeus yesterday was, I think, a perfectly fair question. That's sort of what happened to the United States. It's a combination, I would argue, of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the fatigue with the Middle East, the policies of this administration. It does raise the question of whether there's something deeper, a turn to isolationism in the United States, but there's certainly, in the perception, I think, here and in every Arab government with which I speak, that there is a reduction in U.S. activism and U.S. influence. That negative, though, leads to something that you'd have to call a positive, which is not an alliance between Israel and any Arab states, but objective parallels in interest and policy between Israel and a number of the Arab states, not only Egypt and Jordan, but now many of the Gulf states. These are not alliances, but they are an awareness of certain important common interests and a willingness to acknowledge those common interests. So what are the implications for Israel of that general situation? I think it just increases the importance and the value of, or one might say the reward from, appearing to be a reliable, confident actor, not just presence, actor, when there are very few such reliable, confident actors, and there's so much chaos in the region. What does that mean? Well, for one thing, it means that Israel should continue acting in Syria. There were too many leaks in the United States about what Israel is at least alleged to be doing in Syria, but in the American press there have been a number of accounts of Israeli actions to prevent the movement of weaponry to Hezbollah. And that's at a moment when the United States declined to act. So continuing the actions in Syria is a sign of seriousness to all the region in addition to achieving whatever the individual action does. Continuing close relations with the Egyptian military, especially when the Egyptian military has obviously decided that it is not going anywhere, when the great change that has taken place in Egypt because of the Arab Spring can really be summed up as replacing, as president, an 82-year-old general with a general who's about 25 years younger. That's the Arab Spring in Egypt. So maintaining that very close relationship between the Israeli military and the Egyptian military, I think, is very important. Another lesson, I think, to avoid provocations or mistakes that would cause the Europeans or the United States or Arab neighbors to have to react and diminish the relationship with Israel. And that's easy to say, but kind of hard to define. But what do I mean? I would avoid today operations in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. I would avoid trying to poison anyone in Amman. This is not the moment for that kind of thing because any action can go wrong, and this is a moment when these common interests are being acknowledged. Obviously, I would say Israel should continue to seek the closest possible relations with the United States. Even it will not reach the levels it attained under Clinton and George W. Bush. Doesn't matter. But Israel's value today is as a strong, sober actor. So don't be afraid to act. It enhances the reputation and the value of Israel as a partner or an ally. And not just, I mentioned the example of Syria, but there have been other stories in the American and foreign press about actions even in Sudan to block the Iranian arms shipments, actions in Gaza, of course. I would say this argues for continuing the negotiations with the Palestinians, not because a comprehensive deal is possible. I agree with General Yadlin's general assessment that whether you bought a ticket for the lottery or you didn't buy a ticket for the lottery, that's about what your chances are of a comprehensive agreement. But the fact of negotiations is useful in relations with the Arab states and Europe and the United States, and it helps present this image of Israel as a responsible actor worthy of respect and cooperation. Israel's economic management, which has been so successful, and the gas discoveries also enhance this image of Israel. The goal that Israel is not seen as a troubled or besieged dependency of the United States, but as a rare, valued pillar of power and of prudence in a region that's in turmoil, a valued ally, a desirable secret partner, and the only long-term bet you can place in this entire region. Thank you.